So thank you very much for having me. And you can hear me through the phone?
Yes, all systems go.
I'm really grateful to be here. And I think it may be the first time that I was ever able to speak in a space with pink walls. So I'm particularly happy to be here. And I'll start with a few thank yous. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Princeton for publishing the book. Thank you to all the people who helped me at Princeton, Michelle Comey, and Terry O'Prey and Jody Price. And also, I wanted to thank Jules Spector for being the best research assistant, keeping the typos to a minimum. Everybody needs someone like that to help them. Thank you to Kevin for being here and helping me all through the process, reading my work and talking with me about these issues, which are of importance to both of us. I'm going to advance the slides myself, I think, right? Sorry. There we go. Thank you. So people often ask me why, as an architectural historian, I decided to work on Max Ewing. And when you see images like this, I think my first question is, why not, right? Why wouldn't you want to work on someone who loved dressing up, was so creative, was such an interesting person? A complete unknown, of course, but I discovered Max completely by accident at the Beinecke Library in 2019. I can only blame COVID for the library being shut for 2.5 years to non-Yale people, but I had a fellowship to do research on a topic that was completely unrelated. But one day the librarians couldn't find, very uncharacteristically for Yale, couldn't find a folder of letters that I needed to consult. So I bided my time while they looked for it by checking out a folder of papers that had been written, letters from Paris, by a young American man, Max Ewing, whom I knew about from a fantastic book by Lisa Cohen called All We Know, 3 Lives, a book about 3 queer women in the 20th century. And what I discovered when I read these letters of Max Ewing's was that he knew everybody. I'd never heard of him, most people have never heard of him, but he knew everybody in New York and Paris, and he was a name dropper, but also particularly interested in things that I was interested in, because what I was writing about was about how queer expats had lived in Paris. And the great thing about Max was he not only described what people wore, but how they lived and what the decor of their apartments was, etc. He was friends with Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. He spent weeks traveling with Natalie Barney, as all of this is described in the book in great detail, and her partner, who was particularly interested in befriending Max, Romaine Brooks, the artist. He wrote home to his parents 3 times a week, long letters over the course of 10 years. And also to his friend Muriel Draper, who was a Salinist in New York and also a great art lover. And I figured I'd spend a day or 2 reading these until my documents came back, but that didn't happen, obviously. Not only were there over 1,000 letters, there were amazing albums full of images like these, snapshots, magazine clippings, showing nearly every famous person that Ewing knew. And even more surprising was the number of nude photographs of his friends, bodybuilders, athletes. And Ewing collected all of these images together and put them in very carefully into albums, because he organized all his collections before he left New York in 1933, and then he didn't come back because he ended up, unfortunately, after being unsuccessful as a writer in Hollywood, and particularly in being summoned home by his mother. His father had died in 1932, his mother was ill in 1934, and she summoned him back to his hometown in the Midwest, a small farming town of Pioneer, Ohio, where he had vowed never to return, and which was the antithesis of the queer space that he had created for himself in New York. So who was Max Ewing? He was a queer, starstruck young man who moved to New York City from Pioneer in the fall of 1923. Having dropped out of the University of Michigan just before the start of his senior year, he studied music at college and came to New York with the intention of being a concert pianist. But his main objective, as you can imagine, was to get out of the Midwest and reinvent himself as a queer person in the glamorous city that he dreamed about for years. His hero was the writer and critic Carl Van Vechten, whose work he had known in college and who had written about. And he had practically memorized Van Vechten's descriptions of life in Paris and New York, particularly in a book that was published just as he was leaving Michigan called Peter Whittle. Here you see Van Vechten with his wife, the actress Fania Marinoff, and they were the first people who Ewing called on when he came to the city. And since this is sort of a part reading and part discussion of the book, I thought I would give you a sense of the sound of Max Ewing's voice. So he wrote to his parents after his first visit with Van Vechten, and here's what he said. Last evening, I spent with Carl Van Vechten, alone in his rooms at East 19th Street. I can't begin to describe it now with this pencil in this cold lobby. He wants me to come often. He goes out little, which is not true. But Van Vechten told him that because he wanted to befriend Max Ewing. He said he wants me to come often. He goes out little. He has heard all the music, seen all the plays, known all the artists, read all the books, seen all the pictures, visited all the capitals, and now he's tired of it all. He would rather spend a night talking with me than go out, he says. His cat was lovely. We talked music, books, and pictures. He likes me. He can introduce me to anyone I want to know, but he doesn't know any place where I can live. Writing again the following day, Ewing described Van Vechten's red and yellow silk-lined room in the Fairfax Arms, explaining to his parents back in Pioneer that everything he had experienced was enthralling and life-changing. So thrilling that he was practically walking on air. And here's what he said. The young man who spent last Monday evening with Carl Van Vechten was a creature I can't recognize today at all. My body was there, yes, but where was I? Van Vechten says I'm fascinating. I love Max's authentic queer voice. That's what I fell in love with. And his letters are really a form, for me, of time travel because it's so clear. Excuse me. Thanks to Van Vechten, Ewing was quickly introduced to the glamours of New York. Take out chicken sandwiches, olives and cheese from a deli on 3rd Avenue where Marinoff had picked up dinner, and he quickly began to make the city his own. As he boasted to his parents again the following week, 200 people were turned away from Marinoff's play on Saturday night, and naturally she was happy. I want to see it before long, but I have already acquired the New Yorker's habit of putting plays off. I know I'm here for the season and that the play will have a long run, and my attitude is, well, I'll see it next month. But then we see a different side Carl Van Vechten. And this is where things get interesting. For the next 11 years after that first meeting, Van Vechten would prove to be the most unusual and creative mentor for a queer kid like Max Ewing. Not only did he encourage him to embrace his love of music, art, and theater, he also nurtured his camp sense of humor. As you can see, was hardly a stretch for Van Vechten, who took these self-portraits in 1932. Like many gay men and women at the time, Van Vechten was in fact married, and at least nominally bisexual. The life he shared with Ewing was decidedly queer in every sense of the word. Both men loved collecting objects, and you can see behind him this sort of display of porcelain flowers. Sorry. And he's wearing sailor pants, a recent fashion statement, and a striped sailor shirt. And it might be hard to see, but he's holding a fluffy little white stuffed animal cat. Both men loved cabaret and nightclubs and glamour, especially, the Harlem nightlife that they pursued intensively throughout the 1920s. Both men also fetishized the bodies of Black male entertainers, like the beautiful dancer Paul Mears, who we'll hear more about, an entertainer that they pursued in person and through his pictures. Both men loved celebrity and late night parties, and when Van Vechten took up photography in 1932 and began documenting his queer interracial circle of friends, Ewing did as well, learning a craft that offered another way of collecting the people he was attracted to. But Max did something extremely interesting. Not only did he share images with Van Vechten and create his own, he realized his passion for celebrity, glamour, photography by creating an extraordinary queer space. You see him sitting in it there in 1928. It was in that year that he opened his so-called Gallery of Extraordinary Portraits, a sort of 3D scrapbook in a 4-foot by 4-foot closet with a sink as well, in his apartment, a studio apartment on West 31st Street. Here he is in the space. Here you see, I don't know if it's legible with the lights on, but a self-published catalog of all the images. I'll tell you a little bit about them in a second. So his friends, when they came, could identify the sitters as they perused his collection. The gallery, which I describe in a chapter of the book, included people that Ewing admired, but it also, and knew, but also people he wished he knew. Fashion icons like the Prince of Wales and gorgeous movie stars like Gary Cooper. I circled a bunch of them so you can identify them easily. Gary Cooper was a particular icon of Max's. And he tried to create a sort of encyclopedia of queer heroes, including portraits of Oscar Wilde, which is down below, which I'll show you in a second in detail. Mae West, the writer Radcliffe Hall, whose lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, was at that time the subject of an obscenity trial in London in 1928. One of his special treasures was the portrait here of Cecil Beaton in drag, which the young photographers at the beginning of his career had used as a Christmas card that year. And Max had met him through the parties in his circle in New York. Many images in the collection showed Ewing's bodybuilder friends posing for the sort of physique photos, which you see here. Again, it's probably a little difficult to see the one on the top right. His particular favorite was a bodybuilder and model called Anthony Sansone, who's shown top and right. Also, he has at the very bottom, very hard to see, a photo of his dancer friend, Robert Gorham, who he described to his parents from Paris as just about the handsomest man he'd ever seen. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And among the women were cabaret entertainers like Adelaide Hall and Josephine Baker, whom Ewing had seen in Paris in 1926. He was a lifelong scrapbooker, something that he shared with his mother as a teenager, really interesting, like Andy Warhol, actually. He was particularly keen to acquire signed and inscribed photographs for his collection. You can sort of see that in the picture of Hall. And he maintained the gallery as a constantly changing exhibition where he surrounded himself and his visitors with his most prized photos. The queer family album, so to speak, that he created came to fruition in 1932 with a project of self-produced photos that he called the Carnival of Venice, because he took the pictures of everybody against a backdrop of a pull-down window shade that was printed with a sort of souvenir image of the Piazza San Marco as seen from the water. And he wrote to his parents in 1926 about this queer space and queer family album that he was creating. Another wonderful little snippet of text. All my life has been devoted to developing myself as a hothouse product, and always about 3 times removed from reality. And so you must not be surprised when faced with that fact. I choose to follow a path of glory through a misty region that some eyes can't penetrate. This was the way he wrote and talked to everyone, including his parents, with whom he often shared his fanboy enthusiasms and his crushes on men, interestingly enough. Again, another reason why, as a person interested in gender, sexuality, and particularly in queer studies, why discovering this archive created a situation that I didn't want to turn away from, that I wanted to really explore, because it's so rare to find this sort of richness of image and text. Now, Max's parents ran a dry goods store in Pioneer, Ohio, and his life was completely distant from theirs. But they loved and supported him, even when they didn't really sometimes didn't understand him at all. And he could be arrogant and obnoxious in an almost immature way, almost like a teenager. And sometimes his letters are full of boastful details, and sometimes they're full of petulant. Here's another example. He's writing to his mother about his fascinating social life in New York. He says, I have youth, health, a certain type of beauty. What a real authority, his piano teacher, Alexander Salati, maintains his talent, the opportunity to develop it, enough funds to live, thanks to his parents, not luxuriously, but comfortably in the most stimulating atmosphere in the world. And because I love this part, did not waste my high school and college days at ball games and dances and movies, as you constantly begged me to do, but spent my time reading and cultivating something inside, I have now, through Carl Van Vechten and others, access to the most brilliant artistic circus in the most brilliant city in the world. I should be perfectly happy. I am. I hope you can feel this with me. Given this intimacy and intense connection, it was not surprising to discover that not only the return to Pioneer in 1934, but the death of his parents would be a major blow, and also the backlash against the world of the 1920s. He wasn't a success in Hollywood, but he also realized that the tide was turning, and the sort of freedoms that he had experienced in the 1920s were beginning to evaporate in the face of recurrent and resurgent homophobia, resurgent racism, and the world that he inhabited in New York was beginning to erode, and the world of Pioneer was a place where he felt like a fish out of water. A fish that couldn't survive without the queer space, without the queer environment that he had created. And you get some sense of his friends. In 1932, when he took these pictures, those losses were still, a couple of years in the future. And he had the energy and the sort of self-presentation to record his glittering circled friends. It's hard to see, but you can see he has pictures of Noguchi, Aline McMahon, there's Paul Mears, the cabaret entertainer and dancer. He has pictures of Paul Robeson at the top there, and all against this backdrop. George Platt Lyons was a friend, and you can see him just in this third to the left in the third row, and Bernice Abbott, two emerging young photographers who were learning their craft in a professional, artistic way, just as Ewing was beginning his sort of dilettantish, and he always said, I only take up a pursuit as long as it amuses me, and then I drop it. I'm just basically a dilettante. But he also took pictures, and he had a small exhibition in the Gallery of Modern Art run by Julian Levy. He was friends with Agnes de Mille, E.E. Cummings, Manuel Covarrubias, and the list goes on and on. It's just a sort of mind-boggling. But for me, as I said, even more significant than this amazing gallery of friends are the male nudes. Here's his friend Fred Ritter and his friend and trainer, the boxer Jack Pollock. Sometimes in his writings to his families, he said that Pollock was his trainer, that they were models for the sculpture projects that he was doing. But there's obviously another dimension to his photography, because these are the cropped versions. I was lucky enough to discover the full-length, uncropped versions in Van Vechten's own scrapbooks, which I'll tell you about in a second. He had told the family that the naked man images were destroyed or otherwise disposed of. And so what he did was he put them in his own scrapbooks, Van Vechten, which is great for us. In the end, they show what really Max's intention had been. The letters that both of these men wrote to Max Ewing are incredibly interesting. They give us a sense of a different voice in the 1920s and early 30s. Not only glimpses of the lives they lived as athletes, bodybuilders. The book opens with a quote from Ritter describing the queer parties he was at with George Platt Lyons and the drag balls and other things that they went to. And all of these people come across like characters in Fitzgerald's stories, like Gatsby's friends or the garage owner George Wilson and his wife Myrtle. There's so many different registers in this archive that I enjoyed so much writing about in the book. These are two of the images of Jack Pollock that Van Vechten repurposed for his scrapbooks, and you can see he created collages with the photos that he took, with his sort of camp, humorous, the sky's the limit, sensational trade, eager for sex. And Van Vechten did think of Jack Pollock, the boxer, as trade. So it was a queer, there are 18 of these scrapbooks at Yale, and they're a wonderful resource of queer culture. In the end, Van Vechten, after Max Ewing died, having taken his own life in 1934, he set up this archive. Together, doing the research and getting all the friends to send back letters and amassing whatever he could find, with Max Ewing's cousin, Doris Ewing, but she was a little iffy about the nude photos and the whole queer culture side, and that's why she said, well, maybe you should throw the nudes away. And so we owe Van Vechten an incredible debt. We owe her an incredible debt as well, that she, in the end, was willing to keep so many of them in her cousin's surviving archive. But Van Vechten took the images like this and simply pasted them into his own scrapbook. Because in this way, with the campy captions that Van Vechten collaged, we get a really, another dimension, let's say, of queer history and imagery. The images also of Paul Mears, and I'm almost done, both from the Carnival of Venice, from Max's own scrapbooks, and here he is in Van Vechten's scrapbook, and then just moving forward, we can see that he appears in the full-length version with the captions, Van Vechten's scrapbook again, and these, careful collages of a risque nature. It's kind of private, erotic, humorous, however you want to think of them. And I think people do think of them in various ways. One thing we do know is he closed Van Vechten, his own archive, and these scrapbooks in particular, to researchers for 25 years after his death in 1964. So he didn't want anyone looking, and people, librarians at Yale thought, oh, these boxes that are closed are going to be full of discoveries about his life or about his photography or something. And when they opened them up, they were these 18 erotic scrapbooks, which was, I think, a big surprise. But for people like me and other, Jonathan Weinberg was, I think, the first person to write about them. But also, there are pages like this, which I found incredibly interesting. And that tells us, again, not only, the first one theme is that about these rare survivals of queer studies and rare survivals of original evidence. Also, things like this, which give us a sense of, we don't know exactly when he made these scrapbooks. They were, some of the items are from the 1920s, and they go right up through the 50s. So we don't know exactly, but this one looks like it's from the 20s or 30s. This sexy French sailor in this, with the caption, "My Queer." And for me, it was also really important because people have often questioned the use of the word queer, the slang use, and of course, it was in constant use among queer people from a very early time. For me, it was extremely helpful. I realized that I had a lot to learn, and I learned a lot from Max, and I learned a lot from Carl Van Vechten, who's a very equivocal, complicated character in the history of interracial culture, not only because he wrote a book, published a book with the N-word in the title, and even though he promoted his Black friends' careers as writers, and he thought he was cool, and Van Vechten, and that he could say anything. And, so, but a lot of people have written him off as a racist, or at least as a unconsciously, not like with a deaf ear to what was okay and not okay to say, and that I think is true. But I learned a lot from the historian Emily Bernard, who's written a lot on Van Vechten about the nature of her research and nature of his experience and how he fits into African-American culture and the Harlem Renaissance. But finally, I want to show you two images, because Max is so cool for me that researching him, I began to look for other work, other kinds of images in Van Vechten's archive of photos, which has 9,000 photographs of mostly portraits of his friends and associates and acquaintances, much like Max's, but he took up photography as a lifelong artistic pursuit, and he got better and better at it. But as a sort of side element in Van Vechten's archive are images like this. Because early on, when he first started taking pictures in the 1930s, he started by taking pictures of his closest friends, Natch, and who are his closest friends? This group of queer men, Jimmy Daniels, the entertainer, his Donald Angus, Van Vechten's boyfriend, Prentice Taylor, the artist, Antonio Salvador, who was an actor. And the intimacy of the images, just for me, was a revelation, because I've never seen anything quite like these, certainly in Van Vechten's archive, but really anywhere at all. And the last one, just one of many that I found. And here's Jimmy Daniels, Antonio Salvador, in that same early March photo shoot. And it suggests, I think, how revelatory Max Ewing was for American studies, for queer history, because through him we begin to look at text and images in new ways. He may be an unknown man who died, a young man who died young, a failure, one of the many dreamers, particularly queer dreamers who came to the city to reinvent themselves. But he took risks and he lived very boldly. And even though he ultimately burned out when his parents and his friends disappeared in the dark days, of the Depression and 1934, going back to Pioneer, Ohio, one can only imagine after the glittering life he led. But in the end, it's thanks to the persistence and bravery, not only of Ewing, but of archivists like Van Vechten, that put together all of this wonderful text and image evidence that introduced us to a chapter, a completely different dimension in the history of a well-known period, New York in the 1920s. But now we can see it in a different way through the lens of queer culture in New York City. Anyway, I hope you find the book interesting, and I certainly still find it very interesting. And thank you very much. So now I think, I hope I didn't go on too long. We'll have a little conversation, and then if there's any questions that anyone has, we can, thank you. We can certainly answer them. I can. At this point, there's a lot of overlap between my work on queer domesticity and Kevin's. So there's opportunities to ask both of us about our current work if you're interested. So it's up to you.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Like you, I never get tired of hearing about Max Ewing.
Sorry to cough so much.
He's such a fascinating figure. I have some more general questions, but I have some very specific ones. Let me start with the specific. Why did he choose Venice, do you suppose, as a backdrop for those photos?
Okay, so that's a really great question. There's two reasons, I think. One is that on one of his trips with Romaine Brooks, he spent time in the kind of social whirl of Venice in the 1920s. And he went to the Lido, he went to parties, he met and went to parties with movie people, with Cole Porter. So it was a very important place to him as a glamorous spot. But he also had bought from Muriel Draper, actually, his friend, this pull-down tourist window shade. And I think when he also loved the idea, and this goes to show you how low tech it is. He loved the idea that he would write to his mother and say, oh, they look just like they're in Venice. And they don't look anything like they're really in Venice, but he loved the idea of these glamorous friends of his all posing, and he would write to his mother and say, oh, well, Noguchi, who I just met Noguchi, he's coming to be photographed in Venice next week. So I think it was a really special place for him.
Yeah, I think in the book you talk about the equipment that he used. And it was a Kodak, right?
Yep, it was. And,
Not exactly what Kodak had in mind, I think, right?
no, not what Kodak had in mind, particularly the nudes that he, produced. But it's interesting, Lines, his friend, who was just starting photography in 1929, and actually took both of these pictures, I discovered, that are on the cover of my book. So there's two new Lines photographs in the Lines of, but he also started using a Kodak camera that he had borrowed from Monroe Wheeler, actually. But Max borrowed it from his father. But yes, Kodak was all about family and family holidays, and Max borrowed his father's Kodak camera to not just as a start to take pictures of his trips in Europe, and he made quite a few photographs in New York, I think learning a little bit from Bernice Abbott. But then he then started this project with that same photographic equipment, and then put everything into the folders, left in 1933 for Hollywood, and then died so that Van Vechten could swoop in, and he and his research assistants started labeling everything and putting it into, really creating an archive. It's one of the only fully formed, besides Van Vechten's own papers, fully formed queer archives I think I know.
So when Ewing left New York, how did he arrange the photos? I'm just curious, talking about Kodak and the family photo, I'm beginning to think like, oh, this is like his own like queer family that he's constructed for himself.
Yeah, I would say
So
that.
did he put them in albums in the way that you would like your Aunt Susie and, and your
Yeah,
parents and
I
so
think,
on?
well, that's another great question, because he started out with the Gallery of Extraordinary Portraits, which were in all different formats. And then at one point, he wrote to Van Vechten and said, I understand that you're thoroughly pissed off that I took up photography just when you did, and our mutual friend is saying I do everything and copy you, but it's not true because I want to make some new images from my gallery. Maybe. And then but when he left, well, the first thing he did, because he knew he was going to have the show at Julian Levy Gallery, he printed 70 of them in a large format, and he made an album of those. And he printed the small copy print, a lot of small copy prints, and put those into smaller albums, like family albums, sure. They're, with corners on them, and it's not clear. Some of the typed labels I think he might have put on, and some of the handwritten ones were put on, thank goodness, because a lot of these people, I had no idea who they were, by Van Vechten and Associates. So he did create this queer family album, both in 3D, in the walk-in closet, and in the albums.
Yeah, so that gets me to the other thing I want to talk about, and I don't want to go monopolize the conversation, but I do want to lean into this idea of space, because that's, by your own
What we do.
account, what you're interested in. So, just for the audience, I want to say, like, I knew your work first because you were the pioneer of talking about feminine space from a feminist point of view.
Yes.
And so space is a key element here, and I could see why you were drawn to Ewing, because not only did he take these photos, but he installed them in a space.
Right.
And coming to be in that space was a key part of the performance of the whole thing, right?
But also, he made his apartment where he entertained, broadened it out to being a sort of space, safe space, a queer safe space. And in the past, when I've talked about expat lesbian Paris, for example, I came up with this idea of the lesbian archipelago, because people talk about the left bank, women of the left bank, which is true, but it wasn't as though that whole swath of the city was queer friendly. It was these nodules or islands. And Max created, and so did other of his friends, queer and interracial, and I would say gender positive, open-ended spaces. One of his very dear friends in his early career was as a music hall, working with the Grand Street Follies, was a cross-dressing man who was a wonderful female, what they called a female impersonator at the time. But so all of those spaces that his friends and he created were queer friendly in a way that, as you're asking, I think, treated space as an entity in which not only helped shape identity, but helped shape interactions between people. And I think once he had to go back to Pioneer, where everyone thought of him as a weirdo, right, and a deviant and all of these things, and they certainly had no idea about Jack Pollock and what they were up to in the late nights and that they were keeping, and they would only come down to the store to sell a few pairs of socks, so they had money for cigarettes. And people thought they were wacky, and then so Max got more and more and more depressed. So Jack had this idea that he would throw him in the car, literally, because he was so depressed he didn't want to go, and take him back to New York, which was his, sort of natural habitat. And he didn't make it. They got halfway there, and Max took his own life by jumping into the river. But he had worked himself into that much of a state. But it is interesting that your question, because I think in my work on women as clients of modern houses, they infused those domestic environments that they helped create with a very open-ended notion of gender. And in this instance, we have people who aren't, hiring a man and his friends, who aren't hiring major modernist Bauhaus or anything else architects, but they themselves are creating these spaces that are not just inflected with a queer ethos, let's say, or queer identity, but really are shaped to that end, I think.
That's really interesting, and in a way, you could not have come up with a better name for his hometown if you tried, right?
Right.
That would make more palpable the contrast
Right.
between the rest of the United States and this, somewhat hospitable space of New York that he created for himself. I think of Cole Porter, right, from Peru, Indiana, right?
Yeah.
Kind of similar kind of trajectory.
Well, those photos that we began with, where he's dressed as a kind of gondolier and also in his evening wear, it's just those are 1932. He took his life in June 1934. How would that man have survived on the main street of a farm town? Even when he was wearing his beautiful striped sailor shirt and his white wool pants and all these things that he was so proud of having acquired. Remember, his mother was in the dry goods business, so he was always bragging about the clothes he bought. And she paid for them because she knew that his success socially, but also as a musician, depended on that sort of presentation. But that sort of presentation had nothing to do with Pioneer, as you say. Yeah. And does anybody else have any questions?
Yes.
I mean, we've been kind of going on and on for a while. Yeah.
Okay, I'm listening. This is the first I really know about Maxine. So as a lit person, I'm not really thinking so much about space, but about narrative.
Right.
And how, narrative constructs identity. So I'm sitting here thinking Warhol, creating a space where people can act act in a certain way, but also creating the narrative that goes with it and brings it out into the world and forces people to think about his space in that way because he's there to make that narrative.
Exactly.
But Ewing isn't. So he's got his space, but then he dies and there's no narrative. So I'm thinking
But
about...
while he was in there, he narrated those photographs.
Right. So what I'm just thinking about the difference between really being able to control the narrative and how ephemeral the space can be, even if he's creating it. And we don't know about him, right? I mean, he's not out there in the world known in that way as kind of to make that interracial, queer, interesting New York world presentable to other people. And that strikes me as kind of tragic.
I think it is tragic.
Apart from his suicide,
You know, I think the ephemerality of it is a very interesting way to think, you know, an important word and an important point. That he came into 1923 to New York, he invented himself, he had all these friends, he had extremely wide taste in music and these different environments where he was listening to Stravinsky and then the Lower East Side on the Grand Street Follies. But I think, you know, I hate to belabor this point, but to me it's very poignant that in the way that Fitzgerald constructs an ephemeral world, there's a line in the book that says, by Fitzgerald, that says, when we were having our child, we went back to the Midwest, because who could have a child in that environment of New York where there was so much glamour and loneliness? And Fitzgerald, was very struck by that it was an ephemeral world, with Gatsby, for example, perfect example. And Max, the first thing I thought when I started learning about him was how he was, in a way, the real life realization, and with the friends that he had who spoke in all these different registers, of Fitzgerald's work that we understand better as fiction. But Max Ewing, in a way, and Fitzgerald was in the same circle. He wasn't there to have his picture taken, but Max often says, well, the Fitzgerald was gonna come to Van Vechten's parties, but they were out of town, something of that nature. And so there's a real overlap. And I think they were all struck by how you could create yourself, and then at the end, how that world was ephemeral. And how, I mean, Fitzgerald talks about the skyscrapers and going up into the Empire State Building and looking down and realizing that New York was just a small patch. They thought it was the whole world. And it was just this little place. And where things, poof, they were gone. I mean, it's really, it's a beautiful story in a way. And I think that was one of the reasons Van Vechten put so much effort into preserving Max's world. Anybody else? Any other questions?
I'm curious about the Julian Levy exhibition.
Yeah.
So that was an exhibition of his photographs.
One day,
A one-day exhibition.
with a party, where he asked people to come to the gallery wearing what they wore in their photograph, in their portrait in the series. And he said, no, it was so much fun, because some of the guys came with very little clothes on, even though it was a freezing cold January night. But other people came in their furs, and, you know, he loved it.
And that was in the early 30s.
1933, January 1933, exactly that one day.
Wow.
And then he had a gala with some of the society ladies he took pictures of at the Waldorf Astoria with 2 orchestras that somebody engineered. And I think he thought that all would carry over into Hollywood, and he would be a success as a screenwriter. And he certainly visited a lot of his very successful friends. And then he kept getting rejection notices. And everybody knows those will make you want to jump in the river. You know, it's so depressing. And I think he started spiraling down. And Van Vechten by that point totally never came out of the darkroom, or he took like 5 portraits a day for years. You know, he's just he was a real obsessive invective. So he wasn't available for parties and going out, and he wasn't, I think Max felt a little bit abandoned even before he left New York.
He also showed those weird sculptures, right, at Julian Levy in the
Yes, in the
Surrealism
Surrealism show. So that's another thing that, if you're interested in Julian Levy's gallery, he had an exhibition, the first one in New York of Surrealism. He had 2 of Max's sculptures in there. And someone made a really interesting point that I didn't make in the book. And I thought, this is so great, that's why you get this stuff out there. Max was friends with Florine Stettheimer. And somebody said, he made these weird, they're all of Muriel Draper, who he idolized, literally, she was his idol. But that the little tchotchkes, the found objects and things in the sculpture were very adjacent, let's say, to Florine's work. And I thought, I never thought of that really. Because I was so intent on identifying the people in the Stettheimer series at the Met, you know, for example, the different images of New York.
So he must have known that circle as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And he loved, I mean, the Stettheimers had a lot of food at their parties, and he loved that. He would write to his mother about that, you know, how we thought it was just the first course, and then they brought out more courses of cold meats and potatoes and blah, blah, blah.
And it describes the crazy outfits they wore, right?
Absolutely describes their outfits. He's, you know, a wonderful observer of his time. And if you want to know what Florine and her sisters wore at any given, from 1929 until 1933, Max Ewing is your boy. Well, thank you all for coming on this beautiful evening.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
congratulations on your book, Alice.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, online viewers.